Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this webinar about the environmental stakes of the EU-Mercosur deal, which is currently being negotiated between the EU and the 5 Mercosur countries. We are very happy to welcome you. This is an initiative from IEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and the Green Trade Network, which is a group of over 20 research organizations trying to promote an agenda for a better alignment of trade policies with environmental and climate objectives. And I'm very happy to have gathered this panel of experts from different backgrounds, different perspectives, all members of the Green Trade Network. So with us today, we have Dr. Marcus Gehring, who's an associate professor at the legal faculty of the University of Cambridge and trade counsel at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. We have Mathilde Dupré, who's the director of the Veblen Institute for Economic Reform, Virginia Ensel from Fair Trade Advocacy Office EU, and Antoine Auger, who's the research director of IEP. So together, I think it's a very timely conversation to have. There's been massive farmers' protests recently around the EU-Mercosur, and we as IEP have received a lot of questions from journalists, from stakeholders regarding this agreement. Why is it such a problem? How could it be done better? What is the way forward? Is it going to be blocked? Many questions that this panel will try to address. This is a conversation that is made for you who attend the webinar. So we very much encourage you to ask your questions, write them in the Q&A section. So then we'll be responding to your questions. We'll have it in 2 different segments. So first of all, the panelists will be given 5 minutes maximum for their introductory remarks. And then we'll have another 30 minutes to respond to all the questions you might ask yourself. So yeah, one of the main questions I think is, where do we stand? What's on the table? What is legally feasible? I also wanted to mention that one of the reasons why we gathered this panel today is because with Green Trade Network members, we've worked on this report, which is a report on alternatives for fair and sustainable partnerships between the EU and Mercosur, where we've tried to be both ambitious and pragmatic and look at ways forward to enhance the deal, and look into how necessary certain provisions are, how to make it also more aligned with the revision of the Trade and Sustainable Development Strategy that the European Commission set itself, and try to see a few alternatives that would help break the deadlock that is currently faced by the negotiating parties. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Marcus Gehring for a legal overview, including of the side letters that have been submitted by both parties. What's your opinion about where we are at, Marcus? I know you've been working on a lot of different FTAs in the past, so you also know how much of a great cooperation platform an FTA can be. So what do you expect now from the negotiations moving forward?
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you to everyone on this call for joining us. I think from a legal perspective, if we just benchmark the available drafts, the available side letters, it's very clear to us that this trade deal is much less progressive than the best-in-class trade agreements that the EU has concluded in recent years. Now, granted, the Mercosur agreement has been negotiated for almost 2 decades, nearly 40 rounds of negotiations. But the text that was published almost 4 years ago was a real disappointment, right? It followed the early 2000 model of EU trade agreements and is no longer timely. especially when it comes to the sustainable development commitments. We have seen agreements that make the compliance with the Paris Agreement an essential element. EU-New Zealand, but also, if you want the best-in-class agreement, is the EU-UK TCA, where we do not just rely on decrying climate change as an existential threat to humanity, but rather adapting concrete levels of climate protection that both sides of the agreement have to fulfill. So we are astonished that the Commission is not much more ambitious with the agreement, has not really reopened the initial text. We don't understand that because we've seen much larger changes in the legal scrubbing process, for example, for the CETA agreement. So there could have been a reopening of the text. Instead, the parties seem to pursue the side letter and the side agreement route, which we think is legally inferior because it's not entirely clear how the side letters and how the side agreements will directly relate to the main agreement. We also don't think that what we would call the Chilean option is a good option for the EU-Mercosur agreement, because the Chilean option, just to remind everyone, included a reform of the underlying FTA and then made quite a few promises to renegotiate, for example, the Sustainable Development chapter, with a view to including the Paris Agreement as an essential element of the new trade treaty. But that depends on a lot of trust and a lot of goodwill on both sides. In the EU-Mercosur relationship, especially with the antics of the government of Argentina, I don't see that level of trust. So as a lawyer, I would strongly recommend not to rely on sort of future promises of inclusion of the Paris Agreement. What we've seen, and I'm just coming back from Baku, what we've seen in Baku was an absolute disaster where the Argentinian diplomats and government officials were ordered by the presidential office to withdraw from the climate negotiations. And we've seen in the many advisory opinions that are coming online that the bare minimum you have to do under the Paris Agreement is to attend the ministerial conference and negotiate in good faith. We haven't seen that from Argentina because there are no good reasons to start the negotiations, have the government officials there, and then withdraw. So I'm really worried that this agreement, the side letters, and we haven't seen the exact content, are not yet ready to be signed by the European Union. Yes, it's been a long process. Yes, we've all been analyzing the existing drafts. But unless we make the Paris Agreement and maybe even biodiversity an essential element of our future trading relationships, we can't maintain the high level of climate protection and of nature protection that we have in the European Union. And I should highlight that with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, CISDL, we've now done a series of studies, and not just sort of from the EU side, but especially from the Latin American side. And what we're hearing from the Latin American side, especially the NGO sector, is that the EU should not just rush into an agreement or rely on any kind of future promises, but rather but rather have firm commitments, ideally in the main text of the trade agreement, and then fill it with life once the agreement has been signed and ratified. So with that, thank you very much, Pierre, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and we'll get back to you then during the Q&A session. I just want to remind the participants to put their questions in the Q&A section for the last 30 minutes of the discussion, where they will be able to respond to your questions. Mathilde, I'm turning to you now. France has been leading the charge, I would say, against the deal for many years now, and something that they continue to be doing. You've been highly involved in the debates, both in France and in Brussels, on the compatibility of this deal with our environmental objectives. So of course, we won't be able to address in an hour all the stakes that are related to this deal. We will focus on an environmental perspective to what can be achieved and how bad is it. So I'm turning to you for your analysis of the environmental impacts that the deal can have, and how do you see the way forward in a future collaboration between the EU and the Mercosur countries, which would rely on more sustainable principles. Thank you, Mathilde.
Thank you very much. So I won't repeat what Marcus said, but I wanted to raise this issue at the beginning to say that if the discussion had been stopped since 2019, it was because there was this kind of new doctrine from the EU not to grant trade preferences to countries that are chaired by presidents that are, well, denying their climate commitment on the international scene. And we don't really understand why this wouldn't be the same with the current Argentinian government right now. So this is the first opening remark I wanted to raise. And now, yeah, as we've written in the report, the problem is that we have some big flaws in the agreement itself. First of all, the EU agreement is risking to trap Mercosur countries in an unsustainable agro-export model and further primarizing their economies. And second, we can see that the proposed trade agreement is planning to boost exchange of goods and services in all sectors, and regardless the impact on the environment. So this is something that we've been highlighting a lot. For instance, this includes certain banned pesticides or certain single-use plastic products that are forbidden in the EU market to be exported with lower tariff in Latin American countries. And this is something that we should completely revisit in our new negotiation. So we know that Brazil is already the second largest importer of banned pesticides manufactured in the EU, and even the largest importer of EU-banned neonicotinoids. And as a boomerang effect, the EU is already importing a lot of agricultural goods treated with those banned pesticides, because Brazil is already the second importer of agricultural goods in the European Union. And well, this agreement will further lower trade tariff and trade barriers for those agricultural exports. This is at the heart of the discussion right now in France. I don't know if you've heard the debate in the National Assembly on Tuesday and in the Senate yesterday, but this issue of the norms of production is really main concern from almost all the political groups, and well, it's something that should have been avoided if we would have followed the recommendation of the sustainability impact assessment conducted in 2009 for the EU, which was advising that tariff preferences should be made conditional on effective compliance with sustainability criteria for all the most sensitive products from a climate and biodiversity point of view. But at that time, the answer from the Commission was to disregard this recommendation, because the Commission was considering that it was not the scope of a trade agreement to deal with those issues, and it was only something to be dealt at the domestic level. And this is, I think, now the main problem that we are facing if we want to align our trade agreements with our international commitments on climate or on biodiversity. We need to enter in this discussion, and it's easy. It's not easy. It's complex, and it can create some tension, but it's really crucial. And then the other point I wanted to raise is about deforestation, because it was also something that was highlighted by the expert committee set up by the French government in 2020. And this expert committee said that only for beef, it could increase the agreement's implementation could increase the deforestation between 5 and 25% per year for the first year of the implementation of the agreement. So this is something that could have been partially mitigated by the implementation of the European Deforestation Regulation adopted in 2023. But this regulation, which has been strongly opposed by Mercosur countries and other EU trade partners, is now at risk. And there's a new discussion on the content and on the date of implementation. So again, we can see here all the tension between the EU ambition in the implementation of its international environmental commitment, including for its own consumption, so for imported products, and the fact that the free trade agreement that we are negotiating are not adjusting to this changing paradigm that we are trying to build. And for the next steps, just maybe to say that, of course, there's a strong interest, geopolitical interest to keep discussing and to keep building partnership with those Latin American countries. But maybe we should think about more specific and more focused agreement on very restricted areas, for instance, on raw material, and to try to figure out how could be a win-win agreement in raw material, also for the planet and the people living in the exploitation areas, and not with so many different sectors included in a so broad trade agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde, and also thank you for providing a great segue to our next speaker. Virginia, you were also a lead author of this report, Alternatives for a Fair and Sustainable Partnership between the EU and Mercosur. One of the alternatives that are explored in the report is actually what Mathilde just mentioned, narrowing down the scope of the trade integration between the two blocs. Since you work for the fair trade movement, I think you also have this perspective of what Global South partners expect sometimes from partnership policies and from trade agreements. So if you could come back to one or several of the alternatives on which you've worked in the report, and also tell us how could this become a win-win arrangement without us telling Mercosur what we wanted to consume and what we accept on our markets unilaterally. How can this process of strengthening the sustainability requirements become something more collegial between the two parties? So thanks again for joining us, Virginia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you for everyone joining this webinar. I hope it will be bringing relevant insights into this conversation. So I guess that we all are very aware of the latest developments on both sides of the Atlantic. No need to go there. But something that is actually being published as we speak is that FTIO is part of the European Trade Justice Coalition, and together we have drafted a declaration that has been signed for over 400 different organizations, and we're calling or highlighting a lot of concerns around the deal. What is not reassuring here is the lack of transparency, the lack of scrutiny, the lack of public participation. Also the fact that the Commission is now considering to change the voting process through the splitting of the deal, as it was done with Chile, which would allow to bypass individual country vetoes. That's also not reassuring, goes to the point of lack of scrutiny. This is also a move that has already been condemned by civil society and by different parliamentarians, but that the Commission seems to disregard along the way. When we look at main environmental risks and main pitfalls, as has been highlighted by Mathilde, the deal would exacerbate unequal exchange between the Global South and North countries. The deal would also drive deforestation, exacerbate the climate crisis, promote destructive agricultural models, and all the environmental aspects, but it would also have negative consequences on social and economic aspects that should not be disassociated from the environmental impact. That's one of our main points, to look at the social, economic, and environmental impacts together when we are talking about Mercosur. And when we talk about the social and economic aspects more in detail, there are studies already showing that the deal would threaten food sovereignty in Mercosur countries, that workers in Mercosur countries would suffer job losses, and the worsening of labor condition, with women being more harshly impacted here. So in this sense, an environmental annex, an additional protocol, as has been put forward, would not mitigate the long-term damage, looks a bit more like a greenwashing exercise. And in that sense, I come to the report that we have worked with IAPP colleagues. And one of the alternatives that FTIO developed was one that looked at a bilateral partnership on sustainability issues without access to market, which meant higher level of cooperation with low level of market integration. And what is interesting about this sustainability partnership is that would definitely put sustainability at the core. It would work on the basis of other initiatives like the US-Brazil joint global initiative to advance the rights of working people around the world. It would put the 2030 agenda at the center. It would link to multilateral environmental agreements with the Paris agreements, the CBD, the Global Biodiversity Framework, etc. And it would have certain components for support implementation of new EU market access requirements, which is something relevant for the FTIO. This would look at specifically targeting processes that seek to avoid and mitigate the impacts embedded in EU regulation, ensuring that smallholder farmers and workers, for instance, are able to make a decent living when they are supplying EU markets. This should be a central point in said sustainability partnership with the Mercosur country. And just to close my intervention, another main points that this sustainability partnership should look at is be built on the basis of country priorities. So something that has been mentioned in the Trade and Sustainable Development Review was this country-by-country approach. This is something that should be definitely part of a potential sustainability partnership. There should be work on the basis of minimum objectives, for example, tackling the underlying drivers of sustainability issues that are relevant to the countries. There should be core requirements, for example, having a right-based approach to solving issues, or having multi-stakeholder and inclusive processes for the decision-making processes. A whole, or like a core part, should be also on incentives. looking at, for example, national traceability systems in benchmarking, especially for deforestation, having a sustainable transition fund, and having tools in there to reduce policy barriers that prevent smallholders from receiving a living income, having temporary commodity import bans, looking deeper into sustainable public procurement, etc. And a final component would be to have a financial package that contributes to the transition of the Mercosur region to clean and circular economy. Then I will stop there for now. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you, Virginia. And I'm sure there will be questions about the different approaches between the EU and China, for instance, to addressing deforestation and how different parts of the world are actually throwing money at the deforestation problem, and well, how to position better in this context. But it was very interesting, the overlap in agendas with the acceleration of the conclusion agenda on the side of the European Union and the Commission, and at the same time the release of the ACCTS, which is also with a few countries proving that actually you can put sustainability as an overarching objective of something that resembles a trade agreement, with preferences unlocking depending on objectives agreed upon by both parties, liberalization of green goods and services, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, etc. All of this can be better integrated. The ACCTS is kind of proving it. So yes, there are examples that show that this change in paradigm of how you use trade policy to achieve multiple objectives, well, still needs to be operationalized from the EU side. And that's something that we are still expecting. One of the things that our reports at AEP, and I'm thinking of Antoine's work and our colleague Eileen Blau's work on tailored provisions in trade agreements, was something that was also mentioned in the revision of the Trade and Sustainable Development Strategy of the European Commission, but which doesn't appear here. I've seen questions very interesting on Paris Agreement, and could we single out certain countries depending on the violations of specific provisions of the Paris Agreement. We'll come back to this in a later stage. But I wanted to first turn to Antoine for I think a more general question of the political process and the tensions that the negotiation of the agreement has triggered. We see that now the Commission is seriously contemplating splitting the agreement, passing first the trade component, but they still need to overcome the risk of blocking minority, which would need 35% of the EU population and at least 4 countries. Do you see this happening? So how do you see the political context evolving here in the EU? There were questions also related to this. How likely do you see it being finalized? I think it was from WWF, from Jack. Thank you, Antoine.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and good morning still to everyone. Thank you very much for participating to this webinar. So on that particular point, I would not want to repeat what has been said on the merits of the challenges or the issues that are coming with this EU-Mercosur trade agreement. I want to take a bit of a bigger political picture, let's say, saying that we all know that trade deals have never been a smooth ride. That's never been the case. It was in the past. One can remember the TTIP at the time between the EU and the US, etc. Even at the time when potentially the geopolitical environment could have been more favorable to such trade agreements, yet still this was not a very, very easy way forward. So that's nothing new. But here I think we are reaching new heights in terms of tensions. I mean, now I'm afraid that the agreement is not even looked at in its own merit issues or challenges anymore. I mean, the narrative within the EU to try and hide some of the most potentially problematic sustainability-related issues that we've just outlined is really to put this agreement as a more geopolitical tool. It's like this is a way here to make sure that we strengthen trade relations with, if not like-minded, but at least strategic partners in a context where the election of Trump in the US and the potential enactment of new tariffs once again. That could jeopardize the multilateral trading order, or of course the importance of China for the exports of Mercosur countries, including of beef, for instance, as a potential trade diversion effect if the Mercosur deal was not to be signed. But again, that's not based on the merit or not of the agreement. These are broader geopolitical considerations that come into play, that are coming to the defense of the agreement. So that I'm not saying that we should just avoid or dismiss such considerations, but they are at a higher level. And then when we talk about tension, looking internally within the EU is absolutely staggering. Of course, we have the opposition more and more vocal from farmers. 2024 has been marked by a number of farmers' protests. This is still ongoing, and the Mercosur deal is still very much as a new threat. And this is interesting now to see the political family of the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, the European People parties who have been adamant to sign this particular deal, now taking a somewhat sort of cautious approach because it goes against their other main narrative, which is the defense of the farming community in Europe. So there's a major tension within that particular political family as we speak. And of course, there's a blame game going on as to whether this is the challenges experienced by farmers within the EU is more import-related or more due to what is called regulatory burden, sustainability regulatory burden. So there's this blame game being played at the moment. But nonetheless, we have major tensions within political families in the EU. We also have tensions within the executive. We know that the DG Trade, which has been leading the negotiation of the EU-Mercosur trade deal, might hold very different views from other DGs within the Commission, especially those that have been at the heart of the enactment of these new autonomous measures, such as the EU deforestation regulation and so on. So there's a major tension there as well, which doesn't make the projection of a consistent EU external policy very, very easy. Again, that's never been the case. It's not since Kissinger that we don't have a one phone call. That's still not the case, but that doesn't make it easier at all. Eventually, when looking forward, so whether or not the deal is going to be signed is impossible to say, I think. I'm happy to hear from everyone here, but what we're looking at the moment is at least 4 member state countries opposing the deal. That's France, Poland, Austria, and Ireland, if I'm correct. In and of itself, as Pierre has mentioned, this is not yet there to formally reach the minorities that could block the agreement. So it's still possible. But before we get to that, countries have to agree to split the agreement, because at the moment, it's a larger agreement. It's not just a trade agreement. It involves some political considerations, and that requires Council unanimity, which the Commission will not have, because, for instance, the French cannot just overcome the fact that the National Assembly just recently overwhelmingly voted against the agreement. That's something that cannot just be brushed aside. So the unanimity is not there. That means if you want the agreement, you need to split it. You need to split the trade part. And then you can get into the qualified majority voting. And even so, first of all, countries opposing the deal need to agree to split the deal because you need unanimity to split. And then once you get there, you need the qualified majority. And this is very, very shaky, straightforward. So it's very hard to say, it's impossible to say at this stage whether or not the deal will be agreed upon, but it looks extremely challenging, to say the least. But again, happy to hear from others on the matter. To conclude, I think the EU is once again struggling with its inner tension of projecting values versus interest. It provides contradictory messaging, contradictory narratives, and that makes its positioning extremely hard to read for external partners. On the one hand, we are adamant that we are we have a high ambition on the climate objectives and sustainability objectives and so on. We aim to be vocal in the COP process and so on. We aim to defend multilateralism at the WTO and so on. And on the other, and then we have these autonomous measures that come into play that exporting countries might look much less favorably upon, and then these free trade deals that seem to contradict. That means to just again support this model of commodity lock-in that Matthew was speaking about, and might be quite contradictory again. I think something that we've said a lot recently at IEP is that the EU currently lacks this sort of tool, the actual partnership that can be meaningful for both parties. This is also something that Virginia has been mentioning. Whether these are mini deals or critical material specialized deals, or whether these are more overall overarching partnership, but we connect much more the trade realm with the cooperation realm, with the finance realm, so that eventually we can make a compelling picture as an EU, a compelling picture to partner countries to eventually engage into win-win scenarios. At the moment, the EU doesn't seem very equipped to do that, and yet that's absolutely necessary if we want to navigate the current world in crisis, in my view.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. I see that there is a little debate currently happening in the chat, which is great. I mean, this is why we organize these webinars. It's also to confront views, confront information that we have on the likeliness of a presentation of the deal at the Montevideo Summit on end of next week. But I'd like to now turn to the questions that were posed in the Q&A section, because there were some of them on different topics. But let's start with maybe the most techy ones on the legal aspects of making the Paris Agreement an essential element. One question from Charles, thank you, Charles, for your question, is would it require reopening the agreement, or is it possible to do it through a side letter? Olivier also in the chat puts the question of whether we could single out a country or whether this would impact the entirety of the Mercosur, of the 5 Mercosur countries, especially if we could single out Argentina in the context of what just happened at COP. So let's just start with that. And Marcus, I'm turning to you because you're the lawyer, the expert in the room on all these questions. So, and then we'll get
Pierre,
to the more. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's another one from Liz Kuna in the other tool, also about the Paris Agreement.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I was looking at the chat only, but now I see Liz indeed is asking what Marcus thinks of the added value of the Paris Agreement as an essential element, saying that they are quite skeptical considering the experience with the human rights clauses of EU FTAs. Yeah. So that brings another element of discussion. We have the previous experiences of human rights violation and sanction processes and everything. So how do you see it? Yeah, what's your reaction to this question, Marcus?
Yes, thank you very much, especially to Liz, of course. The Mercosur agreement can increase greenhouse gas emissions, maybe even on both sides. But the whole point of the Paris Agreement is that we have nationally determined contributions that are actually adhered to and ideally fully implemented. I'm quite positive about what making the Paris Agreement an essential element can do, because it doesn't just it's not just confined to the question of material breach or suspension of the entire agreement. It also colors the interpretation of all clauses and the interpretation of individual elements of the agreement, right? So it really has more impact than just relying on the clause itself. I would say, as it's currently drafted, it's not really intended to be used to suspend the entire trading agreement, which theoretically could happen. But it has a strong interpretative and signaling function for the interpretation of the entire rest of the agreement. And I include the agricultural chapter in that. I think if we interpret some of the agricultural commitments in the light of the Paris Agreement, in the light of the long-term climate objective, it becomes a very different meaning. And that's where I see the real value of including the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework as an essential element. Yeah, I don't think you need to reopen the entire agreement. It can be done in a side agreement, as long as the side agreement is intrinsically linked with the main agreement. And that can be a problem, right? So it really depends on the interests of the parties. We have a little explainer of this with footnotes in the brief that we all our organizations put together. If it's just an interpretative side letter with not the same legal value as an international treaty, then no. But if it's linked and given in the main agreement the same legal status, right? Think of the Charter of Fundamental Rights being referenced in the Treaty on European Union, right? That kind of linkage of agreement would then make the Paris Agreement an essential element, not just of the side letter, but of the entire agreement. But it really depends on the legal detail. And of course, to be absolutely certain, we would need to reopen the main agreement, at least to give the same legal value to the side letters, in my view. And any party, any country, any entity can breach, right? So what we can't do is the question about Argentina, for example, and there it would constitute a breach of the EU-Mercosur agreement with potential consequences for all Mercosur countries. That's being part of these interregional agreements. It happens to the EU a lot, right? The EU had a lot of disputes against it in, for example, the WTO, when the measure just came from one or two member states. That is inherent in this kind of relationship. And I think it's going to become much more important. We'll see quite a few breaches of the Paris Agreement come February 10th, when 2025, when the new NDCs are due, because not very many countries have actually updated and increased the ambition in their nationally determined contributions. I'm quite positive about Brazil. Brazil's new NDC is really worth reading for all of us, because it contains really important policy developments. And you've heard 10 days ago, the ETS passed the final parliamentary hurdle. So there will be an ETS measure in Brazil, which I think is very, very positive, and has to do with the relationship between Brazil and the European Union, in my view.
But can I add just
Sure, Mathilde. Just go ahead.
something quickly? We have the same assessment of the human rights essential clauses, because they were perceived in some way as a nuclear weapon. No, if we suspend all the agreement, well, it has never been done properly, and if we have this issue of having a bloc and not only a country, it adds a layer of complexity also. So I think it's reinforced the probability for such a clause for never being used. So I would really say that it's not enough to add such a clause, even if it would be agreed by both blocs. It wouldn't be enough to make the deal aligned and compliant with our international commitment. And maybe also one thing that we were looking at the blend was also to try to be more precise in this essential element clause. What could be put in what is the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and for instance, climate finance from developed countries could also be something that could be included, not to show that we are only thinking that the other are potentially not the one who will not comply with their commitment, but also to show that we are serious about our own commitment too.
to make the FTA a parallel route to addressing the failures of the multilateral climate system at the moment, failure of this COP in particular, to reaching the level of climate finance commitments that is needed. That's a very interesting idea. I think we have, for the 15 minutes that remain in the webinar, I'd like us to address two groups of questions. The first group of questions is about what concessions would you expect to be kind of satisfied with a future deal between the EU and Mercosur. And that brings us back maybe to the report and to the work that you've done. Maybe concretely, if we could take away a few ideas on how this could be stronger in terms of sustainability commitments. And then on the other hand, what's the interaction between signing an FTA and implementing unilateral measures at the EU level? I've seen questions from Ryan, for instance, from S&P, questions on deforestation, also on to what level is it legal and is it possible to also make the adaptation and the interaction of regimes, of unilateral regimes, part of an FTA negotiation? Is it an opportunity to link, for instance, ETS, as the question of Ryan, and to agree on the implementation of those instruments? So I think if we could try to focus on these two aspects before closing, that would be great. Just checking if there is any other question. No, all right. So who'd like to go first?
If you want, I can give it a go. Perhaps with a more radical view on this. But yeah, the way that we are looking at trade agreements now from a fair trade movement perspective is that the mechanism is not working to the actors that we are working with, which means smallholder farmers, small producers, agricultural and other workers, and SMEs. So in terms of general recommendations around trade agreements, and of course it touches upon Mercosur, we would like to see cooperation vehicles between the two blocs that are based on real and binding assessments of the impacts that this would have at any level, and of course also at market access level, and also putting forward market access measures on both ecosystems and local communities. As I expressed before around the alternative of bilateral partnerships, we would like to see their financial packages that go in different directions, but one of the directions is the facilitation of compliance with EU market access requirements. And this links to your second part of where you want to focus, which is the unilateral measures, because what we see a lot is that you have a trade agreement that goes in one direction that may be looking at opening markets, but on the other hand, the EU introduces unilateral measures like deforestation, which can be de facto barriers to trade, and that because of their design may de facto push small actors out of the market, which I guess is not the intention when we speak about smallholder driven supply chains like cocoa or coffee. So definitely we would like to see financial packages put in there, ideally in the context of trade agreements, of other form of agreements that goes in these directions. And the last thing that I want to highlight is that for us, when it comes to partnerships, be that trade agreements or whatever other method, there should also be assistance measures to, again, go in different directions, but one of them to support with the sustainable management of resources and fair allocation of value along value and supply chains, as well as raising the capacity of local actors to comply with the EU's environmental and labor regulations. And I think this is key because also links to the EU unilateral measures and the intention of the EU to push imports to comply with the same EU standards. But you need to put in place mechanisms to help going in that direction. Thanks.
Go ahead, Marcus, if you want to.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to come in. And of course, the observation that the human rights clauses in trade agreements have only been used, I think, 7 times. That is not good enough given the human rights situation. But for example, we've seen even just the discussions on suspending the trade agreement, for example, with Israel, has taken place in the Council, has led to some public debates also inside the European Union. So do not underestimate the availability of this, maybe somewhat nuclear option. Of course, what would be much preferable, and I think I said that, would be something like the TCA, where if the other side violates and deviates from joint commitments such as the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's an immediate reaction, suspension of trade benefits in the relationship, right? That keeps everyone on their toes and is perhaps less politically charged when it comes to the exercising of these clauses. Of course, there will always be member states that have a much harder time, say, suspending certain elements of the trade relationship with partner countries. But in my view, that could be overcome in the trading relationship, and especially if we go with the latest sustainable development policy, trade policy of the EU, where at least the labor clauses and the climate commitments, maybe even biodiversity, are part of the normal dispute settlement mechanism, right? And could lead after the dispute settlement mechanism to the suspension of trade obligations. Just the expert process is perhaps not enough when it comes to these really fundamental elements. I think from the perspective of our trading partners, it's suboptimal to use autonomous measures when we've, as an EU, tried to put those measures on the table in a bilateral negotiations and couldn't succeed, right? So one of the criticisms of the autonomous measures is that, why didn't you negotiate that in a bilateral trade treaty? I think, if we had more support for anti-deforestation measures in the trade agreement and, created a mechanism that was bilateral, I think some of those measures would be turbocharged and really have the environmental impact that we want them to have. So those are just a few thoughts on that particular debate.
But maybe to add on that, the tricky part is that we are already importing a lot from Mercosur countries. So even if we had put mirror clauses in the deal with sustainability criteria for the new quota that we were negotiating, it wouldn't mean that all the imports from those countries would apply to those sustainability requirements. So this is, first of all, a big challenge, for instance, for soy, where the tariffs are already to zero. How do we tackle the environmental impact of those imports in a bilateral negotiation when there's no more negotiation to have on trade barriers? And also, I would like to say that one thing which is certain is that we need to put much more effort in multilateral discussion. For instance, the fora where we discuss the sanitary standards is Codex Alimentarius, which is integrated to the FAO and the WTO organization. And in this fora, we only look at the security and at the sanitary aspect of the standards. So, for instance, on pesticides, there is no consideration of environmental impact. So how can we still be negotiating at international level standards without taking into account environmental issues after the discussion that we had on the biodiversity framework? This is something that should be changed, and the EU should be putting much more effort on those international discussions. And but the thing is, we know that it takes a lot of time, and sometimes the fact that we take some unilateral measure can also trigger some of those discussions that are difficult to have at international and multilateral level.
Thank you, Mathilde. Related to the fact that we already are importing so much from Mercosur, I think that was one of the arguments of the people tending to defend and to be positive about the conclusion of this deal. It's because they would tend to think that no deal is worse than the current state of trade between Mercosur and the EU, and that the deal going into the limbo of the negotiating fatigue, etc., for how many years we don't know, would be worse than actually concluding this one. So if you have a reaction on this, I'd be curious as well. But the priority goes to the participants, and we have another question from Caroline Bertram, who says, as far as I understand, the Commission is not willing to offer trade concessions in return for TSD commitments. Hence, this limits what can be obtained. I'm curious to know whether the speaker thinks the EU should, let's say, back down on geographical indicators or the standards to have strong environmental provisions included. Priority goes to this question, so I'll maybe turn to Antoine if you want.
Well, thank you, Corinne. This is a very interesting stance, and of course, this is now comes down to a negotiating position. And I think the short answer, we don't have a lot of time left, but I think the short answer at the moment is that there's very, very little appetite on the EU side to lower the IP protection or the GI protections. That's actually one of the core, usually, requirements of the EU in its trade negotiation. So to jeopardize in any way such provisions, even for higher sustainability or environmental standards, seems extremely unlikely in my view. But perhaps this could, in any case, as a negotiating stance, that if we're not talking IP or GIs, for instance, we could perhaps imagine some other considerations, especially those that are key for the exporting partner of our partner, whereby the strategic interest would be more taken into account on something that is less sensitive for us, in exchange, of course, for environmental considerations. That, again, that's part of the negotiation. I'm afraid the way I experience DigiTrade's approach to this is that it's much more, let's say, trade volumes and value first, environmental considerations after. TSD chapters are considered as an add-on, as something on top of it. And this is extremely hard. When you face a partner that's not necessarily interested, like India, for instance, not necessarily interested in environmental considerations, then how can you meaningfully integrate this into your negotiating stance if you literally don't do it from the start? So I think, Caroline, what you say is extremely interesting, and I think this is what the EU should be doing, perhaps not on IPRGI, because that's in my mind, but eventually we need to integrate environmental considerations at the start of the negotiation as a negotiating position, rather than an add-on that needs to be dealt with with additional document letters and so on at the very end of a 20 years old deal.
Any other reaction to that? I think we can quickly do a last tour de table between the panelists, and then we'll have to close.
Well, maybe I've heard last week one of the key negotiators of this EU-Mercosur agreement who said on TV in France that the Green Deal commitment were going too far. So I think this is also the quite representative of the level of commitment from some trade negotiator on environmental issues, and if they are not taking the EU commitment on the international level seriously, and not feeling committed to implement them also in the trade policy, this is a great challenge that we are all facing.
Thank you, Mathieu. Marcus?
Yeah, I completely agree. We need to move away from the old standard model of you give, I give, trade negotiations and move into a model where sustainable development is at the heart and at the core of our trading relationship. It can't be considered a side letter or an add-on. It needs to be at the heart of our agreement, and it needs to be really streamlined into all chapters, especially the substantive chapters of the trading relationship. We can't decarbonize and reach net zero in our own economy if we have trade relationships where we just simply export all our emissions and we export all our nature destructions to all other parts of the world. So we need to have the partners on board. We need to help them to achieve their NDCs and their nature plans, and at the same time make sure that the trading relationship is fair for both sides, right? So I think unless we see a fundamental rethink and all trade agreements in the end look like the new acts that New Zealand has agreed, i.e. is a sustainable development agreement rather than just a trade agreement, I don't think we're going to make much progress. Thank you very much, Pierre, for convening us, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you, Marcus. Virginia, would you like to?
Yeah, really brief, but really building on what Marcus has just said, sort of like next steps. I would really encourage everybody, like all of us and everybody that is participating here, to not stop talking about it, to not stop highlighting what should not go forward, what is wrong more clearly, and what could be alternatives to this. Even if it may seem like a futile exercise because we're not winning, we need to continue to do so and get more and more people to listen to, hey, this is not the right approach, and look at the arguments that may be considered by those that are making the decisions.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Virginia. Now it's already time to say goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This is what the Green Trade Network is about, discussing how we can do better, and we are still hopeful that things can be achieved in the next years. So stay in the loop, register and subscribe to the GTN newsletter, and we'll stay in touch for future conversations about FTAs, unilateral measures. The WTO will still be around. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Merci, Mathilde. Bye bye.
Merci.